So to find the answers to our questions, we've come back to where it all started, St. Leo University. And today we're going to ask our resident lion what he knows about the Q matrix. Hi Fritz, do you know what a cognitive diagnostic model is? Oh, he does not look too happy to be asked these questions. You know what a Q matrix is and what misspecification is? Still nothing. Okay, one last question, I promise. What's a linear logistic test model? Wow, he's not playing. I think he's got too much pride and he doesn't want to be caught lying about his answers. Well, looks like we're gonna have to move on and see if we can find an expert on campus that might be able to answer our questions. To find the answers to these gender-changing questions, we've sought out some of the experts in the field. Today, we're in the Institutional Effectiveness Office of Jeffrey Anderson, Dr. Jeffrey Anderson at St. Leo University. Hello, Dr. Anderson.
Good afternoon.
I have a few questions for you.
Certainly.
What's a cognitive diagnostic model?
A cognitive diagnostic model. Let me check. Cognitive diagnostic model is a model that diagnoses the cognition. How's that sound?
I think that sounds acceptable.
Well, it's a little bit weak, I'll have to admit. It's probably an underspecified explanation of a cognitive diagnostic model. But let's move on.
Well, since we're on the product of misspecifications, do you know what a Q matrix is and what misspecification is?
Well, I think the Q matrix is from this movie, and it comes out in the third, after Matrix Revisited, where they said, "Surprised to see me, Mr. Anderson?" There is one other area in which misspecification, quite frankly, it bugs the hell out of me. That is, I go to MacDonald. I used to trust MacDonald, but I don't anymore, because here's a MacDonald. I ordered it. I opened it up. Where is my tomato and lettuce? It's not here. That's an underspecified MacDonald model. Now, if I could add the tomato and lettuce, and of course, you want to put it in the correct order, so the pickles go on top of the tomato and the tomato goes on top of the lettuce, you may think, oh, that's a well-specified model, but it isn't. It's overspecified because I don't like onions and they put onions on there. Now, if I take off the onions, an extraneous variable, and I put on top of the burger, the cheese, the lettuce, the tomato, the pickle, and the bun, I have a well-specified MacDonald. We call these the George. So that's another area, but that really is more in food science.
What is a linear logistic test model?
Is a whole different thing, and it's much more something that is kind of field-based. I experienced it myself after imbibing at Kiefer's Twilight Brewing. I was making the logistic way home when these red lights pulled up behind me, and they got me out of my vehicle and they put a straight line on the road and they asked me to perambulate that line. See, that's the linear test. And so the logistics was trying to get home, and the linear test was trying to walk that straight line. And statisticians have a hard time walking a straight line with a straight face. So that is what I have found to be the logistic linear test model that really has greatest personal relevance to me.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Anytime you wish to have miscommunication, you give me a call, because I've got big news, and these are things that most Americans don't know, but I know them.
To find out the answers to our questions, we've stopped in to see one of the resident experts at USF, Dr. Dedrick. Hi, Dr. Dedrick. How are you today?
I'm doing well.
So I have a question for you. What's a Q matrix?
So let's back up a little bit on the Q matrix. So when we create tests, we use the data from tests to make decisions, and the decision what we're trying to make is what problem or what weakness or what strengths a person might have. So we're trying to do a diagnosis, and these models are used a lot in reading and in math. So you were describing something outside of reading and math, but if we took reading as an example, we have a reading test with items, and we want to know what skills does a student need to be able to answer a reading item. And so what we have is an item, which is we would put that in the row of the Q matrix, and in the columns would be specific skills. So skills could be things like being able to make inferences or be able to, sort words out. So we usually have reading experts who tell us what the skills are. So some items may only require one skill, and some items may require two skills, some might require more than that. So when we make the matrix, the rows are the items and the columns are the skills, and if a skill is needed, we put a 1, and if it's not needed, we put a 0. So when we get our data, that model is then imposed on our data to see if the data fit the model. And if the data fit the model, we can then use the results of the model to help sort out what strengths and weaknesses students have, so we can help them improve in their reading or their math. In your case, yours is more of a psychological measure, which is not as common, I would say, in terms of cognitive diagnostic assessment, since it's, even though there's a cognitive part, usually reading and math have a much stronger cognitive part. That's it.
Further investigation into the answers about what cognitive diagnostic models have led us here to one of our doctoral candidate offices, where we find Simone Jenkins. Hi, Simone. How are you today?
Hi, how are you?
I'm here to ask you a few questions about cognitive diagnostic models. What is a cognitive diagnostic model from your experience?
Now, here's what I think you should think about. Cognitive diagnostic model. Now, when you think of cognitive, you think about the mind, processing, cognition, if you will, which is more of a qualitative emphasis, especially when you think about the paradigm under which you would research it, which would probably be best under a post-positivism as opposed to the positivist more frame of mind, where it's a little bit more rigid and regimented and so forth, whereas with the other paradigm, you have a little bit more wiggle room. You're contemplating the epistemology. You're actually deciding, or not really deciding, but you're thinking about the origin of knowledge and so forth. So I think when you think cognitive, it's better to kind of come from that perspective, and then you decide to conduct your study, of course, which would be a qualitative study where you gain information from your research participants, and they're able to provide with their voice. And from there, you go through a process, which I actually like to use coding when I go through my qualitative analysis. And then from there, you develop a series of themes that, I guess commonalities, if you will, among your research participants. And as a result, you're able to draw conclusions and, in fact, implications that you can use and disseminate within your research. So that's kind of what I think of in that respect.
Continuing our discussion on Dimitrov, initially I was assigned this article in January by Dr. MacDonald. He said to take the time, make a response or read it, make a response to it, and have fun with the project. So as you can see, we've had a lot of fun with Dr. Anderson, Simone, and Dr. Dedrick. My own response, I read this article 5 times, and I didn't understand any of it. So I took some time and I started one day just, I took probably 3 or 4 days to go over line by line and underline anything I found that they had acronyms and I didn't understand. So there was a lot of Googling. I Googled initially DINA, which was the deterministic inputs, noisy, and gate model. Still didn't understand it. So it took an entire 16 weeks with George to even remotely come to understand this. And it's as it applies to my own research, because he used my own data in helping me figure out, what these things were, and also I could have just, probably done a lot better of a job if I read his dissertation first, but that's okay. So the article talks about dimensionality, like unidimensionality, like one cognitive measure, or one dimension, about how unidimensionality measures only one construct, like one dimension. My study was a multi-dimensional study, so like where you've measured more than one dimensions. I believe we had like 9 or 10 by the time we were done because we added suicide. What else? So it discussed about how the GRE is considered a multi-dimensional test because it measures like verbal, math, and reasoning abilities. Some tests are unidimensional, but for the sake of this, it wasn't. We discussed logits in my internship. So for this article, Dimitrov talks about like ability scores and like the odds of success. George and I talked about that. I had some trouble like figuring out how the odds ratio was supposed to be written. So like this article gave an example of how like the probability of success could be like 80% and the failure rate could be 20. So the odds ratio would be 4 to 1. I see why George does not like this article as much as he should, because he likes negative infinity to positive infinity when it comes to logits. And this one actually mentions restricting it to -4 to +4, with 0 being the origin point. So I got you there on that one. We also discussed for this IRT models, well, Dimitrov does. And he talks about 1PL, Reggie, 2PL, George, and 3PL. Really, George, you didn't tell me about 3PL. No idea what that's supposed to be. So this was talking about like the one parameter logistic model, and I remember us discussing about my project about how Reggie ran the 1PL and the 2PL, and how for the 1PL everything was smooth. My distribution looked great, but then when we started looking at the 2PL model, it was spiked up. Like my distribution was quite a funny look to it, and so there wasn't a lot of like flattening how it should have been initially in the 1PL. Like it was weird. Also, Dimitrov talks about how he uses uses his Q matrix to determine if a person will fail or pass an exam. So for instance, like George, with your test, how you told me initially that you know that if a person fails your test, it's likely that they're not going to pass it again. So that kind of comes in with like your probability of success on like the harder items and the easier items. Like if they get the easier items, sure, they'll get those right in the future. But if they don't score well on those hard items, then that's kind of how you know they're not going to pass the next time, because they didn't get some of those hard items. Embertson in this section on methodology. We discussed a lot about Embertson this semester, I remember, for item response theory. And so this one, an example that was given was the cognitive processing model of reading. So for instance, Embertson uses multiple areas for comprehension. It is multidimensional, such as like encoding and coherence of a passage. It also, for this study, it also includes concerns itself with like response decision of reading comprehension. So like for the GRE, it mentions shorter passages requiring less of a memory load than longer passages. Additionally, it says like for integration of that stuff into the memory, it's also shorter than for longer passages. So that verbal section on the GRE, actually, if it's a shorter passage, it's like easier. Long versus like the longer passages being harder to remember. Section, we're going to discuss the least square distance model just briefly, because a lot of it I really don't understand. And George, you know this because we covered it, but we didn't cover other sections of this article, which I would have liked to, because obviously I'm not going to understand it without more instruction. But for instance, like this it goes back to like 1PL, 2PL, and 3PL, and like the probability of correct responses. So like an item response and the product of probability being correct, and the process of an attribution by an item. So like for instance, if you score well in this area, and it's an easy item. When we look at like the harder item, how'd you do? Okay, so you missed some of the easier items, but you did better on the harder items. And then it's like a mathematical thing that they put together, like a formula, where they look at like the item difficulty by person ability. So I remember that section. That's where I'm going to end on Dimitrov, because I don't feel like I have a really enough of a solid grasp to respond anymore to it. I do want to say thank you to Dr. Jeffrey Anderson for participating. I really like the idea to include a song in the intro about Cream, or from the rock band Cream, rather. Dr. Dedrick, thank you so much for being patient and helping me out and letting me interview you. Simone, thank you for the digs on qualitative versus quantitative. And additionally, George, thank you so much for giving me a great internship experience.